Thank you, everyone. This is it's a pleasure to be in front of an audience this engaged at this time of the year. I think we were planning, Nick, 20 minutes? 20 minutes, but I think I see a number of faces in this room I expect questions from, so I'm going to try and keep the presentation part as short as possible and maybe trying to get a bit of a discussion going. I am going to mention Trump and Brexit and the federal election, but I'm not going to get too morbid about it. I think what I want to do first is just get you to think about what we now know, having seen it repeated between Britain and the United States, that there is a clear political separation between the cities, the urban centres that are connected to the global economy and the rest of the country. Now in the US they talk about red states, blue states, but most of the analysis coming out of the election just been is that there are blue cities and that the rest of the country is red. And pretty much in all the swing states that Trump triumphed, Clinton still took the capital city. It's in the rest of state that she didn't do so well. In fact, it tells you how good Obama was, that he was able to get a second term in what is globally a pretty terrible anti-incumbent cycle across the world, that he was actually able to get a second term with an unemployment rate that was just coming off 10%. Brexit's more interesting to me because I can do a very, very quick analysis of the British political scene, which will give you a very, very quick recognition point in Australia. And I want to tell you about what London looks like today for those of you who haven't checked the numbers lately. London voted to remain, as did Liverpool and Manchester. The rest of England voted to leave. Wales voted to leave. Scotland, for different reasons, voted to remain, as did Northern Ireland. Now, of course, if you had your standard Australian majority vote plus majority of states, the leave vote wouldn't have got up. But they had a very, very low threshold for a decision that dramatic. So that's really, I think that's really on David Cameron that he set the question up so badly. But remember what you're looking at with that Brexit vote, which happened just 9 days before our federal election, is you had the main urban centres of England voting to remain in the European Union, the rest of England voting to leave, Wales voting to leave, and Scotland and Northern Ireland voting to remain. Now the reason why I'm going to zero in on London for a second is you will very quickly recognise what this city looks like today. It actually doesn't look like old England, it actually looks like Melbourne and Sydney. 37% of the population of London are those born overseas. In Sydney it's at 39 from the 2011 census. I think the number's going to be a bit higher. In Melbourne it's 35. So basically London sits in between Melbourne and Sydney. Just over 10 of that 37% comes from Asia. Just under 10's from Europe, 5 from Africa, 2 from the Middle East. Now the Anzacs, which are Australians and the Kiwis, are just 1 percentage point of the population of London, so there aren't that many of them there. A Eurasian-centred migration program in a global city like London, obviously, people living there, whether you're white or whether you're yellow or whether you're olive-skinned, you think your kids have a stake in the 21st century. It's actually the simplest political statement you can make in the 21st century. They vote to remain. The rest of England, which is a lot whiter than London, so the Brits have got 11, 12, 13% born overseas. You treble that number when you get to London. Now, as I say, London looks like Sydney and Melbourne today, but the thing that makes us a little different from the UK, and certainly very different from the US, is that we've got 2, not 1 city, that are very, very cosmopolitan, which is Melbourne and Sydney. But across the nation, we are a very, very big immigrant population. 28% born overseas, 20%, at least one parent who's a migrant. So 48% of Australia today is first or second generation migrant. In Melbourne, in Sydney and in Perth, but I'll talk to you about Perth in a second why it's different. In Melbourne, Sydney and Perth, you got between 35 and 40% born overseas and another 25% second generation. So 2/3 of each of those 3 cities is first or second generation. The last time the colonies looked like that was the 1870s. Okay, so the number of people who've been coming into Australia in the last 15 years have actually lifted from a population that was 21, 22% overseas born at the turn of the 21st century, is now at 28. There's quite a dramatic change in our ethnic face. In Melbourne and Sydney, you don't notice it because we've been running a very, very big migration program for the last 60 and 70 years. In fact, the addition of the Chinese and Indians in Australia today is a logical extension of the program that began after the Second World War with the arrival of Southern Europeans and Northern Europeans. Now, that story of the urban centre that feels connected to the 21st century and the rest of the country not feeling so connected to the 21st century and wanting to do the things that they did in Brexit and that they did in the US with the election of Trump. Do you see something like that playing out in Australia today? Now, the interesting thing about the federal election we had in July is that the question wasn't asked, but the electorate already gave the same answer. And I've had a good look at the numbers. Sort of the dense detail is in the monthly, which has just come out. I've had some friends on the Liberal side ring me up, wanting to argue this line or that line, but not to argue the central premise. And that is when you look at our electoral map at the last federal election, remember this is an election when either side really offered you a stark choice. Jobs and growth versus Mediscare is what? It's a bit like the 2010 campaign, moving forward versus stop the boats. Two leaders who weren't leaders at the beginning of that parliament, well, sorry, Bill Shorten was, but two leaders who, you know, other things being equal, probably shouldn't have been in that job at the time in 2016. It was certainly the case in 2010. Now, the country did a very interesting thing in both those elections, and I was sort of kicking myself that I didn't notice it earlier because I would have screamed into print almost immediately after the election, because I think a lot of my colleagues missed. It's not even a subtlety, it's actually pretty obvious when you look at the way the votes landed. Forget people's analysis of what this voter did versus what that voter did, and divide the country up as you would a Britain or in America, between the city and the rest of the state, and between the cities and states that are growing and the states that are not growing at the moment. Now in Australia, the southeast corner, Melbourne, Sydney, and I'd add Canberra to that southeast corner, clearly is doing better than the rest of the country. And as I flagged earlier, it's also high immigration population, very Eurasian ethnic face. In Victoria, New South Wales, and the ACT, the Labor Party won a majority of seats in each of those areas. And in fact, it's the first time in our federal history that the party that won the majority of seats in Victoria and New South Wales did not get to form government. Think about that for a second. I'm going to leave Queensland and WA out of the equation for the moment. Look at Northern Territory, South Australia and Tasmania. That is your dead centre of Australia. That's where you have above the odds Indigenous disadvantage in the Northern Territory and above the odds white disadvantage in especially Tasmania and to a lesser extent South Australia. The coalition were wiped out in those three states. Did not win a single seat in the Northern Territory, did not win a single seat in Tasmania, and only won the 4 in South Australia. So suddenly you've got 6 states and 2 territories, sorry, 4 states and 2 territories voting Labor. So how'd you lose? I assume there's some Labor people in the room tonight. So how'd you lose the election? In Queensland and WA, notwithstanding the fact that there's a cosmopolitan Liberal leader in Malcolm Turnbull, in Queensland and WA, 2 states that are wider than the national average, much wider than the national average. In fact, Brisbane is the one big capital city that doesn't have an immigrant population that matches with the national average of 28%. It's a bit below 28%. And in Perth, most of the immigrant action is from England, South Africa, and to a lesser extent New Zealand. The Chinese and Indians haven't chosen Perth over Sydney or Melbourne, they've gone to Sydney or Melbourne. In both Queensland and in Western Australia, the Liberal Party had near historic high seat counts in both those states. That is why they are the government today. Those 2 states alone basically held them up. Now, I'm not going to read through the detail, you can look them up yourself, but it's actually quite a fascinating thing. It's never happened this way before. The 2 mining states have never decided who got to govern Australia. But as I say, there's a bit of an echo in the 2010 election because Rudd got himself into trouble and lost the prime ministership. The Labor vote collapsed in Queensland, and Labor weren't that strong in WA to begin with. Queensland and WA almost made Tony Abbott Prime Minister. They saved Malcolm Turnbull's Prime Ministership. And the reason why I'm repeating this point is you couldn't have two more different Liberal leaders, but the same voter turned up for both of them. Now the same voter turned up for both of them because at the end of the GFC, at the end of the mining boom, Queensland and WA doesn't feel connected to the rest of the country. And it expresses that, and it's unusual that they've expressed it in an incumbent kind of way, but they are conservative. Now conservative isn't a good or a bad thing, it's just the way they feel about the world at the moment. They'd be Republican voters or they'd be voting to leave. The thing that's actually held our parliament together and has held our system together up until now is that the centre, i.e. South Australia and Tassie, are sending negotiators to the federal parliament. Hanson didn't do at all well in Tassie or South Australia. In fact, Jackie Lambie's Senate vote versus Hanson's Senate vote is 3-1, I think. A Xenophon, not a Hanson, is negotiating with Turnbull in the Senate. The fact that Hanson's actually negotiating, I'll put that one to one side, but I don't know what possessed her, but anyway, good luck to her. I think she's actually come back, to be honest, I think she's come back a lot smarter than, a lot more politically savvy than the last time around. I think that's a fair point. A lot of the stuff that's coming out of her mouth is as outrageous as it was in '96. Maybe there isn't the shock factor that there was in '96, but she this time around is looking to be more than a once-up. But as I said, the thing that's keeping our system together up until now is that the two poorest states are sending negotiators to the federal parliament. When I look, I am going to flick to Trump at the moment, and just briefly, the question Trump asked of the American voter was, do you want to blow your system up? Stripped of all the other stuff, stripped of the misogyny, stripped of the racism, stripped of the anti-globalisation, stripped of the craving of, a return to a middle-class society that they probably will never get back to. He was asking people, not just business as usual, not just payout on the elites, do you actually want to blow your system up? And they answered yes. Not by much, but they did answer yes. Today, I don't think you can ask that question in Australia. And I think one of the reasons you can't ask that question in Australia is you wouldn't get a yes beyond WA and Queensland. And even then, in WA, you probably wouldn't get a yes everywhere. And there are parts of Brisbane you wouldn't get a yes in either. What I would worry about as a political, now I'll get to the social and the economic stuff in a sec, what I'd worry about as a political observer is when South Australia and Tasmania feel so separated from the rest of the country that they find common purpose with two states that politically have always viewed themselves as outsiders. When that balance tips from 2/3 of the country wants in to 1/3 is clearly in because they're winning, which is down here, Sydney and Canberra, but the rest of the country doesn't feel connected, then you'd really start to worry. Because I think what the Americans are about to go through now is it's going to be very impossible to recreate whatever the normal was before Trump after he's gone. Because I think once you do what he did to that system, what he's about to do to their system, which is basically throw the rule book out, it is very hard to piece it all back together again. There's a couple of observations, cultural observations in the way politics is played in Australia, and things that have been concerning me for a number of years now, which you see writ large in the US system. One side of politics comes up with an idea, the other side feels compelled to oppose it. And it doesn't matter what it is. And it's not just a personality clash between an Abbott and a Gillard, or even within a government between a Gillard and a Rudd, or between an Abbott and a Turnbull. It is much more fundamental than that. Now, I know there's a couple of interesting case studies here in Victoria between road and rail, and I also know between water. There's within the water debate, some of the Victorian colleagues here would remember a few years ago, Brax didn't want to do desalination. Then he decides to do it. The other side want to do it first, and then they decide they didn't want to do it. Now, it seems like a small issue, but it's not a small issue when you think about the infrastructure story in Australia today. I can't believe in this state, of all states, that we're crippled on the choice between road and rail, and that each time we change government, we do a complete reset on the infrastructure agenda. As I say, this is an observation of political culture. It's been this way now, sort of my observation, for about 10 or 15 years. I grew up in reporting a political world where if the other side had a good idea, you were incentivised in politics to pinch it, not to oppose it, and to make it your own. Now the other side are the dumbest people you've ever known. That's the way people think today. Now you waste a lot of time when you acquire power looking in the rearview mirror trying to undo what the previous government did. And the reason it matters a lot to us today is not even getting to the Trump scenario. The reason it matters a lot to us today is that our population story, which I think is the single most important story in Australia today. It is as important to Australia today as the need to deregulate coming out of the 70s was in the 80s and 90s. You don't hear enough about this issue, but I'll explain why we need to think about it. In each decade after the Second World War, the population grew, and this is a very, very simple equation. Ken Henry always helps me out with this. About 2 million a decade. 200,000 people a year. Just over half that was net natural increase, and the balance is from overseas. So the permanent settlement from migration is about 80 to 100,000 a year. First decade alone of the 21st century, and you feel it here in Victoria because there are a lot of cranes in the sky now as we try to catch up, and we're doing bypasses and we're doing Skyrail and all that. In the first decade alone of the 21st century, the population grew by 3, not 2 million, 300,000 a year. That extra million, the extra 100,000 a year came from overseas. Now that extra 100,000 a year has caught governments like this one on the hop because they're always undercounting. So I covered a number of state budgets in Victoria after I came back from Canberra, and each year there was a line in there that pretty much said we undercounted the population in the previous budget, so we're behind here, there and everywhere. But in the short term, while the mining boom was still underway and the first phase of the property boom was still underway, the undercount didn't seem to affect the Treasurer because the Treasurer reported a bigger surplus than he expected. Now, of course, we know what that undercount means. We've been playing catch-up in the infrastructure space now for a good 10 to 15 years in Victoria. It's also the story in New South Wales. Weirdly, it's become the story in Hobart because, I don't know if any of you have been to Hobart lately, they're gridlocked at the moment as they're doing a couple of capital works. Now, this extra million people is going to be the least of our worries, I suspect, if we can get an active government conversation going. But if we don't get an active government conversation going, here's a couple of other things to think about. And I know Brian Howe's here, and I'm almost expecting a question from him on city planning and decentralisation. Here's the other thing to think about. Even on the mid-case projection from the Bureau of Statistics, we're going to go from 24 million today to about 35 or 40 million by the middle of the century. Where are the next 10 to 15 million people going to go? That's why I say I think the population story today is the most important policy story in Australia today. Left to their own devices, most of them will end up in Melbourne and Sydney. Now here, if we come back in 10 or 20 years' time, we'll mark the point where Melbourne is larger than Sydney again, because it is going to happen on current trends. And in fact, it might happen by 2035, which will be 200th anniversary of the illegal settlement of Melbourne by John Batman and John Faulkner, respectively, which would be quite a magnificent day if you think about it. Get back to number one after 200 years, because the first 50 we were one, next 150 we were always the second city, but now we're going to be first city again. But imagine what a Melbourne at 6, 7 and 8 million is going to feel like. Imagine what a Sydney at 8 million is going to feel like. The Economist Intelligence Unit, when it measures livability, it finds the cities in the top 10, and a lot of our cities are in the top 10. We've got 3 this year. Last year we had 4. Sydney's just dropped out. High income, low density cities. There's a tipping point. I don't know what the number is today, but most of the bureaucratic advice, I think, based on global analysis, that about 4 to 5 million cities reach a point almost of no return in terms of their standard of living and their livability. It is very difficult to make the next million who live in the outer ring. You can't service them as well, you can't educate their kids as well, to maintain a standard of living that people in the inner city are enjoying and in the middle ring suburbs. That's why you don't have a New York or a Paris or a London in the top 10. Now, when I look at where the next 10 to 15 million people are going to go over the next generation and a half, as I said, left to its own devices, the population will continue to repeat the patterns of the last 20 to 30 years. Most of them will end up in Melbourne or Sydney. I actually don't think that is viable, but I don't think we're ready for the conversation yet on how to move them somewhere else. Especially when what's driving the boom in population in Melbourne and Sydney is the arrival of migrants from China and India, which are two rising nations exporting their middle class on a scale that we haven't seen in Australia since the gold rush of the 1850s. Now, the Chinese and Indians today outnumber the English-born for the first time in history. The Chinese and Indians have a median age of around 34, 35. The median age for the English-born in Australia is about 55, so half of them are retirees. The Chinese and Indians, most of the new arrivals, land on the top of the social economic structure. No migrant has done that in Australia on scale since the gold rush of the 1850s. Migrants who arrive to Australia today aren't like my parents starting at the bottom and you measure the success of the program via their home ownership and then their kids, Australian-born kids' education. Most of the new arrivals are taking full-time jobs. I'm going to put the 457 and the temporary debate to one side. Most of the new arrivals that settle in Australia take a full-time job. Bob Gregory's got a statistic which a lot of people in the government tell him not to repeat because it sort of comes out funny when the tabloids translate it. The net addition of full-time jobs in Australia since 2008, whatever that number is, and it's a couple of 100,000 or something, it's a bit more than a couple of 100,000 I think, every one of those jobs has gone to a migrant. Because if you think about what's happening within the local-born labour market, the new entrant is basically replacing the retiree, so there's a revolving door going on there. So where the economy is growing, where it's adding jobs, construction, professional services especially, because in the professions, and also in social care and assistance for women, most of them are taken up by migrants. In that country, in the country we're living in now, if that next 15 million, if most of the next 15 million, I don't mean each of the 15 million because there'll be a fair bit of net addition to the population from local born, but think about the migrants that are coming in the next 20 or 30 years. If they're going to repeat the pattern of the last 15 and they consolidate the gains at the top and in the middle rungs of the income ladder, now first point is how does the infrastructure system keep up with them? And we know we're doing a big catch-up. Second and more important point for my mind is how does the education system make sure that every kid can keep up with the new arrival. And we've never had to think about that before as a country. Now, I'm a big Australia guy. I'm cheering the migrant as they come in, but if I were to fashion some advice, some strategic advice for Conservatives and Labor people alike, you don't want to be the party that 10 years from now forgot to educate your kids. Because the backlash, it may not be a Trump or a Brexit, but it won't matter. There'll be something going on that will be almost impossible to contain. And I haven't even mentioned land use, environmental sustainability. I haven't mentioned what the political story is in the next 20 or 30 years if Melbourne and Sydney are these two booming Eurasian capitals, disconnected from the rest of the country. You know, with interests for its citizens which may even cut across what? National foreign policy, economic policy. Think about the resentments that might build up when you've got two super cities. I mean, we'll all be here, we'll be fine, but think about the resentments that build up in the rest of the country. America is kind of a warning in one respect, because so much of America has been left out for so long. But I still think the bigger warning for us is what happened in the UK. Because a lot of people who voted to leave actually had pretty decent salaries and pretty well educated, but they identified as white. They saw London as this sort of separate cosmopolitan entity. It no longer felt like the city that the rest of the country could relate to, because you could send your smartest kid to work in the city of London. It felt like the rest of the world and the rest of Europe had taken over this city, and the city itself was doing well, but they didn't recognise it. Now remember, their problem in the past, in sort of absorbing the new arrival, was the new arrival started at the bottom, and they're pretty racist people to begin with, the Brits, no disrespect. They've always had a problem that we never had with the new arrival. Now you multiply that, because the new arrival is doing not dissimilar things to what they're doing here, what they're doing in a place like Toronto, what they're doing in Auckland. So whilst I say, just to summarise, whilst I can tell you a terrific migration story, until we start thinking about what the demands on the system are from the step up in our intake. Remember, if we're going from 2 million to 3 million a decade, and in fact we're not even going to be at 3 million this decade, I think we're tracking towards 4 for net addition of population, because basically we didn't have a pause after the GFC. What happened after the GFC was the door stayed open. And in fact the intakes didn't do what they did in the past when you had a slowing in the economy. They didn't do this, they actually did that. And there are different reasons why the Chinese are coming now, say, compared to a few years ago. There's a bit of middle class flight from China, and I think the relative price of property in Australia versus the price of property, high-end property in China, there's quite a big gap there, and there's a fair reason why you'd want to send at least one kid, if you're a member of the elite in China, to Australia to get a tertiary degree and to buy a house. So there's any number of reasons to be miserable about what happened in the US. We might laugh at what happened to the Brits, but any number of reasons to be miserable. I don't want us to be miserable. I actually want us to look at our trajectory and imagine what it would look like if it worked. Now, what it would look like if it worked will be this country that we finally thought, we've been, wanting Australia to become something for a long, long time. We've actually now got, for reasons that have less to do with us and more to do with the decisions made by the world's globally mobile migrant to come to a place like this. Given that we've got them, given the challenges it poses for public policy across the board, I use a phrase in the quarterly essay which is active government. I didn't want to use interventionist, I didn't want to use any of the old Keynesian pump priming. I just wanted to start the conversation that given the scale of population growth that we're dealing with, the government can't sit back and say it's got nothing to do with me. Because the market has never been equipped to deal with city planning, education, health, infrastructure. And in fact, if you ask John Howard about this stuff, he'd go, isn't this what Robert Menzies used to do? I just think this is a policy active room that we're talking to. Think about how you would translate what is actually happening for the role of government in the next 10 to 20 years. And also think about reframing some of the conversations that we've all been having up until this point. A lot of the old language around inequality, around intervention, around multiculturalism, a lot of those conversations actually getting in the way of the threshold understanding across the political spectrum of what the very, very simple needs are of coping with success. Because there's no other way to describe what's happening to us, but we are being forced to cope with success. So a phrase like inequality is polarising, not to people in this room, but it is to a conservative. So I wouldn't use the word inequality of conservative, but I would use the word livability, say, when we're talking about cities. I'd also use a word like not America. So in your conversations with Conservatives, maybe the first thing you need to remind them is what their failure to appreciate what's going on in the 21st century will inevitably lead to their political movement, which is that some guy will come in from nowhere and take it over. I think education, which is inevitably a very polarised debate, and we've just seen the headlines. The Federal Education Minister thought that Kazakhstan created Borat, the character. I don't know if any of you saw that. Did you see that quote? Okay. So the line was, notwithstanding, their contribution to culture through, the movie Borat, which had nothing to do with them anyway, it's a parody. That's quite a polarised debate. Something for Conservatives to think about. I know there are no Conservatives in the room, but I trust you have some Conservative friends when you talk to them. Ask them what happens in the next 10 or 20 years when the private school system starts to ration places for their kids. Ask them that question. And they know that their kids are probably not as motivated as the new arrivals' kids. Ask them that question. Ask them whether they think their constituency can afford the fees when the places start being rationed. Then they might think about the public system again. Do you know what I mean? Like I say, I think there's a number of ways to view the outline of what is already before our eyes as the starting point for a re-engagement in an active government, but also policy discussions that might help us get past not just the polarisation, but the lockjaw, I think, around the political system at the moment in response to both Brexit and Trump.